So when we first encounter non-duality, it's usually from this position of being a separate subject of experience, which is living in this objectively existing world. And then we encounter non-duality, and the basic suggestion is that there actually isn't this separate subject of experience. And what there actually is just this reality here, which doesn't consist of two separate parts. It doesn't consist of one separate subject and an outside objective world. What can be discovered is that the reality of our experience essentially consists of one non-separate, awake, unbounded openness, which is taking the form, taking the shape of all our experiences. So reality, therefore, is discovered to be always whole, always complete, never separate, never dual. And in this complete realization, of course, there's a tremendous amount of peace to be found. But what we will run into is the fact that, of course, the relative world of experience doesn't cease to exist. There is still the experience of a body existing in a world, having life circumstances, having challenges, even having a story. So what do we do about all of this then? And we can of course have different attitudes about what to do here. One possibility is just to dismiss this relative kind of existence and just fixate on the fact that in absolute terms there is no relative existence. Now, of course, this is true in some sense. On an ultimate kind of level, we really can say that a world doesn't exist, people don't exist, life circumstances don't exist. This is not an inherently untrue statement. But the tendency is, of course, to then dismiss the reality of relative existence, to kind of downplay it as unimportant, as unessential. And this kind of attitude is, of course, reinforced by the fact that this realization of the absolute carries so much peace with it, the sense of wholeness. So in some sense we might wonder, well, why not just stay there? Why isn't that good enough? Why do I need to respect this relative realm of existence where there are people and there are actions and there are consequences and all of that? And of course, in an essential way, you can just do whatever you want. I mean, if this is how you want to go about life, you can very much do that. But in my experience, this kind of attitude of dismissing relative reality really has tremendous downsides to it. The challenging but essential realization I'm talking about is that the relative level of existence and the absolute level of existence are not separate. They are non-dual. So this is a different way of understanding non-duality. It's not just about seeing the non-duality between the apparent subject of experience, but also seeing that there is no duality between this absolute transcendental level where there are no separate objects or beings, and this more relative level where there are people, where there is a world. It's challenging because a lot of times we, in a sense, don't want to come back down from the mountaintop of realization. We think that re-engaging with the world in these relative terms will destroy our peace. And so we hang out in this kind of detached state where the world is just taken to be unreal. It's just a movie, it's just a dream. And maybe for a while that can work out for you. Maybe that will feel better than what your previous experience was. But I find that eventually one will always encounter problems that make this kind of attitude untenable. The fact of the matter is that when we dismiss the relative level of our experience, it doesn't mean that this level doesn't affect us anymore. We can just pretend to be above our emotions, above our trauma, above our story, and dismiss all of that. But that doesn't mean that these aspects of relative reality won't affect your experience. Eventually you will find that they very much do. And this becomes especially clear when you actually engage with the world, when you engage with this relative reality which you're trying to dismiss. Because then all these patterns which we are essentially trying to ignore with our non-dual realization will rise up and very much affect how we are behaving, how we are thinking, how we are feeling. And of course, that poses a kind of threat to this peace we have found. And so there's always this kind of underlying fear of being pulled out of our peace, out of our realization, into this relativity where there are all these challenges. And when we do have this tendency to detach in an unhealthy way, this will become especially obvious in romantic relationships, I find. Because these kinds of relationships really tend to bring out the most challenging as well as the most beautiful parts of yourself. And if there are all these underlying patterns, which are in a sense unresolved, that will continue to affect how you live life and how your experience is. And just dismissing that and saying, oh, all these patterns and how I act in my relationship, it just doesn't matter because essentially I'm always whole and I'm always at peace. That might sound nice in theory, but the reality of your experience will tell you something different. This gets me to the second point about why recognizing this non-duality between the absolute and the relative is so essential. From my own experience, I can say that when this non-duality between the relative and the absolute is realized, that the peace which we feel is quite different. It doesn't have this kind of detached flavor to it anymore, which might be nice in of itself, but it's quite different from this full embrace of the world, where true nature is not just whole and complete, but it's absolutely intimate with all the facets of our experience. This wholeness which is then felt is really quite different. This flavor of peace, this inherent happiness, is then really felt. Something I found very helpful in actually dissolving this separation between the relative and the absolute is to change the way we look at the relative level in a sense. I mean, even calling it relative as opposed to absolute kind of is a mistake, because this term relative seems to suggest that it's somehow less than, it's not as valuable, it's not as important. But the way I like to look at it is more so the fact that reality can appear in an infinite number of ways. It can appear as unbounded, outside of space and time, totally free. But it can also appear as this human being living the story of its life. It's not that one way of looking at it is inherently better or superior to the other. They are both just ways in which reality can appear to itself. And they are both amazing and valuable in their own right. In the beginning, the mistake we were trying to correct is that we were only looking at the world through this lens of being a separate subject. But of course, looking at the world in this way is not inherently bad. One way of looking at reality is not inherently superior to another. The issue only arises when we are fixated, when we are believing one perspective on reality to be the absolute truth of it, when we believe that this is all there is. And this is of course why spiritual practice is so important, because it shows us conclusively in our experience that reality totally transcends any particular way of looking at it. So bridging this sort of gap, seeing that there is no separation between all these ways in which reality can appear, that they are all just facets and ways of looking at the same diamond. That is the essential thing to realize. And the peace, the wholeness, the freedom which we are longing for is then realized. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my latest videos. You can also leave a comment if anything about this remains unclear. And you can visit my website if you want to get in direct contact with me. Other than that, thanks for watching, and I will see you right here next time.